Hello, everyone. Today we have Anna Maria presenting on chapter 5.
Here, so the first intifada, the Al-Hijara intifada, as I've seen it called elsewhere, which means the Intifada of Stones. This took place from 1987 to 1993, and it marked a shift, I suppose, in terms of how resistance was taking place inside and outside of Palestine. So despite the fact that the PLO was weakened following the events of 1982, there emerged a growth in Palestinian nationalism, and resistance came from inside occupied Palestine. And this was a really important point about this particular event. So it was launched ostensibly in response to Israel's invasion of South Lebanon, intended to quash the PLO, but actually triggered by the killing of 4 Palestinians in the Jabalia refugee camp who had been run over by an Israeli-driven truck. And as Khalidi says, Gaza quickly became the epicenter of this resistance, and spontaneous outbreaks were quickly replaced by organised grassroots actions led by the newly formed secret Unified National Leadership Organization. And these networks, because they were flexible and clandestine, very quickly became very effective and very, very difficult for the Israeli army to deal with. So in response to the uprising and to the pockets of resistance that were emerging inside of Palestine, Rabban implemented the Iron Fist policy, which was a policy based on physical brutality and violence, and encapsulated in this image of the armed Israeli soldier cracking the bones of unarmed Palestinian youth, and also encapsulated in images of, fully kitted out soldiers opposite stone-throwing youths. And this type of imagery went around the world and eroded some of the support that there was internationally for the Israeli case and the Israeli cause. And so it became apparent that the Israelis were losing the PR battle, even though they might have been able to crack down quite violently on the resistance. So they had to consider how they might respond to the images of sanctioned state violence, or state-sanctioned violence, I should say. And there were, of course, these media reframings as well of the small Palestinian boy facing an Israeli tank. Therefore, the David versus Goliath image and metaphor was very useful. And in this case, the Israelis were perceived as Goliath. So that was obviously not something that was desirable for them in terms of how they wished to present themselves. And also, the Intifada dispelled the idea that the occupation of the last 20 years was what the Israelis like to describe as an enlightened occupation. So Khalidi moves on, having kind of given a description of the events and how it unfolded, to talking about what the lead up to this was. And he outlines how there were increased curbs on civil liberties and freedom of expression throughout the 1970s, which curbs were often materialized in the form of punishment, violence, and imprisonment. So it wasn't necessarily a legalistic approach to resistance. Rather, it was a very, very physical and brutal approach to suppressing violence in order to teach the Palestinians a lesson. In 1976, several PLO leaders won mayoral elections in different towns in occupied Palestine, and some of them were deported in 1980 and others then removed from office in 1982, which of course enraged the Palestinians. So much so that the attempted creation then of collaborationist village leagues at local level failed because the removal of these mayors was so unpopular. He does outline in the book how the village leagues were spearheaded by Israeli intelligence, and he references a character that occurs frequently throughout any account of Israeli history, which is this hybrid creature of the academic and soldier. And this person crops up in the form of different individuals in this chapter as well. So these are people who have this military side, but also expertise, academic expertise. They appear as scientific experts, but also as negotiators, as propagandists, and so on, in the Israeli pantheon of, I would like to say villains, but of operators. So another aspect to this, to the lead up, was the coming of age of a new generation. And these young people were much more emboldened than their elders. They were much more inclined to take to the streets in mass protests. And they were often met by also a new generation of young Israelis who were also more readily violent. And that violence, Khalidi tells us, was motivated in part by the way in which they had been indoctrinated and educated to fear and loathe the Palestinians, and to believe that the only way to suppress the irrational hostility that they saw coming from the Palestinians was through the use of absolute force. He also points out to us that the Intifada was particularly successful because it enjoyed cross-societal support. Everybody from every social category was behind this. And on the right-hand side here, you see a rather famous image of Micheline Awad. She's a Christian woman who was coming from Mass and who decided to take off her shoes and to join some youths in throwing stones as a form of resistance. And she was angered as well by the presence of the Israelis and by the suppression and by the occupation. And I put her here, of course, because Khalidi refers to the involvement of women and the significance of that, more broadly for the involvement of marginalised groups, as he puts it, in this intifada. The kinds of resistance that were offered included things like strikes, boycotts, and withholding taxes. So it was by and large non-violent. Naturally, there was violence on both sides, far more from the Israelis, but overall, it was a non-violent intifada. So, in summary, here it was a popular movement. It was a grassroots movement. It was a unifying movement. It brought people together. It trained new kinds of leadership, different to the PLO, who were at that stage in exile in Tunis, and it also affected a positive international image projection. So its success was also due to articulate communicators inside and outside of Palestine, and he mentions people like Hanan Ashrawi and Edward Said, who was outside of Israel. And the success of the Intifada also made it clear that the occupation as it was absolutely untenable, and this was apparent to the Israeli authorities as well too. Success was a threat to the PLO elites, which tried to co-opt the movement. And initially, their involvement was welcomed because people recognized that they had made significant sacrifices in their time in Jordan and also in Lebanon. But over time, this involvement became fraught for reasons which will become apparent, or which became apparent later in the chapter. The leadership was exiled in Tunis, and they didn't understand the complexities of daily life in the occupied territories. They were removed in geographical terms, physical terms, but also somewhat emotionally and mentally removed as well too from the daily lives of the people in the occupied territories. One person was singled out here, and that was Abu Jihad, the Fatah leader, and he was assassinated by Israel in 1988. And this again is a character to me that occurs across the books that we read, and the history of Israel that we're slowly learning, which is this, and Khalidi mentions it himself in the chapter, this effective leader of a group who is singled out because he is effective and targeted and removed or eliminated by the Israeli authorities. And we've seen that quite recently as well. And then the PLO was also weakened by the emergence of Hamas in 1987. So Khalidi, makes no bones about his disapproval, I suppose, of the way in which the PLO conducted their business and their overestimation of their capabilities and their, inability to tune into the needs of the people whom they were representing. So he says that they never really fully understood the US, and they never really they didn't try to win over American hearts and minds. And they sought unsuccessfully to apply strategies for dealing with Arab leaders to Western leaders. So the kind of petitioning that they might have done with Arab leaders, or the personal touch kind of politics that they had there, those sorts of strategies didn't necessarily fly in the Western context in the same way. And Arafat particularly comes in for criticism in that regard. They assumed wrongly that petro-connections of politicians in the US, such as Bush and Baker and others, would make them pro-Arab. But of course, that didn't make them pro-Arab. It just indicated their interest in money. And then in 1988, the Palestinian Declaration of Independence was made. And this was hugely significant. And Khalidi says that the document formally abandoned the PLO's claim to the entirety of Palestine, accepting the principles of partition, a two-state solution and a peaceful resolution to the conflict. An accompanying political communique accepted SC 242 and SC 338 as the basis for a peace conference. So this kind of brings us on to the next section. And this is a section that Khalidi himself is very deeply invested in personally, because he was present for some of the negotiations that emerged later on as a result of the series of events that are unfolding at this time. And he's also highly critical of decisions that were made. So he's kind of anatomizing in some detail what went wrong and why it went wrong. So he is critical of Arafat's decision, I suppose, to accept these resolutions without understanding the consequences and the outcomes of this acceptance. He also critiques the continued failure of the PLO to recognise and understand that the Camp David secret US commitments to Israeli interests, what that might actually imply and what that might mean. He seems to suggest, I think, that they're not particularly worldly wise, or that they didn't have the intelligence that they needed to have, or didn't listen to what intelligence they had that was, directing them towards a more efficient involvement. And then another development, I've put it here on a slide labeled setback and failure. I wouldn't necessarily view it that way, but the PLO certainly abandoned our armed struggle outside the Palestinian territories on the basis of the Iqbal Ahmad report. And that might be even something that we could talk about in the discussion later. So Iqbal Ahmad was a Pakistani who had been involved in Algeria with the FLN there, and who knew Frantz Fanon and others. And his estimation of the effectiveness of armed struggle for the PLO was that it was feeding the victimhood of the Israelis, and it was actually counterproductive as a strategy. A setback definitely was for the PLO at least, was the collapse of the USSR and the opening up of a power vacuum, even though Khalidi makes the point that the support from the USSR was intermittent and not always substantial. A major setback and error was the support for Iraq of Arafat and the PLO, who turned their back, I suppose, on the Palestinian population in Kuwait by evincing this support. And Khalidi outlines in some detail rather intricate relationship that there was between the Kuwaiti Palestinians and their life there, their schools, their freedom of expression, their ability to live there, provided they weren't politically active, and the different kinds of power groupings that were aligned or not aligned with the interests of the Palestinians and based in Iraq. And also, obviously these power groupings, some of them were mercenary, some of them pledged fealty to Saddam Hussein, some were more inclined in the direction of Syria, but it all seems to have been quite volatile. And certainly there were miscalculations made there in terms of the pragmatism of the backing for Iraq. And these miscalculations were actually fatal for the PLO in terms of its support after the Gulf War from Arab states more generally. Khalidi then talks about the peace conference in Madrid in 1991 and in 1993. He tells us that he was part of the delegation that attended and that he had been invited, but initially was accepted only on the basis that he assumed that these negotiations would not take place. And then they did go ahead, and he gives us first-hand insight to the kinds of wheeling and dealing that take place at these negotiations, who gets a seat at the table and who doesn't, who sets the parameters of the discussions and who doesn't. And the net conclusion there is that the Israelis always set the parameters, that the US were dishonest brokers, that they might position themselves as honest brokers, but were not so at all, because Camp David was always there in the background. They were always going to represent Israel's interests. He does single out for positive comment, albeit limited positive comment, James Baker, and for negative comment, Dennis Ross, the US official whose tenure in the Washington administration was lengthy and who was very much pro-Israel, and who influenced the course of these negotiations, which over and over again ran into the sand, over and over again reduced the Palestinian territory and rights of Palestinians. Separately, there were secret negotiations happening. There was also, of course, the carving up of the occupied territories via Oslo 1 and 2, and the return of Arafat from exile. And Khalidi describes it as him moving from one cage to another. And he concludes here that there was a stasis, and that's the overall conclusion, I think, of the chapter coming to the end of it. But just to have a quick look here at Oslo 2, he does talk about the creation of areas A, B, and C in some detail in the chapter. And you can see here the way in which the control of the territories is what was being negotiated here. And this was all connected to the huge question, which was the question around Palestinian sovereignty, self-determination, and statehood. And I've also heard other people describing the people who lived in the occupied territories as subjects, not citizens. And this was, of course, the nub of these negotiations. And the Israelis were never going to concede to the needs that the Palestinians had, and the PLO were never going to be able to articulate those needs properly either. So if you look at the map here, he tells us, Khalidi does, that 18% of the territory and security in Area A are controlled by the Palestinian Authority, 22% of the territory administrative control is by the Palestinian Authority, and security controls by Israel. And then over 60% in Area C of the territory is in Area C, and it's under complete Israeli control. And following Oslo 2 as well, Israel retained full control of Palestine entry and exit and of population registered. And he writes this poignant paragraph where he talks about how the settlements continued, the walls, the barriers, the checkpoints, and the fences that were erected sliced and delimited the landscape. He makes the point that the costs for a lot of what happens in these territories in terms of how they're administered are borne by the Palestinians, but the rights are exercised by the Israelis. So in sum then, the First Intifada marked the emergence of an internal grassroots resistance. It also sat alongside a shift in the world balance of power. He describing the Arafat and the PLO, it's a tale of failure and decline. And then, as he has threaded through the book, throughout, linked to his own personal history, he tells anecdotes about, traveling in a taxi or meeting a relative who's helps him with family trouble, or working in Jerusalem and observing difficulties entering and exiting Jerusalem, and so on. So some of these personal touches I've listed there below. And this lends the chapter and the book as a whole, authenticity. His voice is present behind what's happening, and it makes the history a very personal history, as well as a very powerful political history.
That's great, Anna Maria. Thank you so much. You did a great job. That was a whole bunch